The chart shows the average percentages in typical meals of 3 types of nutrients, all of which may be unhealthy if eaten too much. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features, and make comparisons where relevant. Sample Essay 1. The pie charts display the average proportions of 3 categories of nutrients consumed in typical meals, all of which may be harmful to health if overconsumed. Overall, while the intake of sodium and saturated fat is higher at dinner than at any other meal, added sugar is eaten most in snacks. Sodium consumption is highest at dinner and second highest at lunch, making up 43% and 29% of total sodium consumption respectively. The proportions of this type of nutrient taken in at snack time and breakfast are the same, both at 14%. Dinner and lunch also account for the largest and the second largest proportions of total saturated fat intake respectively, at 37% and 26%. However, a greater proportion is eaten at snack time than at breakfast at 21% and 16% respectively. Compared with the other two nutrients, added sugar has a relatively low consumption level at dinner, at 23%. It is snacks that are the greatest source of sugar intake, at 42%. However, like the other nutrients, it is also consumed least at breakfast, at only 16%. 185 words. Sample 2. The 3 pie charts demonstrate the proportion of 3 nutrients, sodium, saturated fat and added sugar, each being absorbed in 4 typical meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks, in the United States. In general, people consume the most sodium and saturated fat in dinner, and the most added sugar in snacks. The diagram for sodium resembles the one of saturated fat, showing that more than half of the consumption of the two ingredients are conducted in dinner and lunch. Sodium is consumed 43% in dinner, 29% in lunch, and 14% in both breakfast and snacks. The sequence is the same for saturated fat, with a number of percentage being 37%, 26%, 21%, and 16% respectively, whereas the ratio of added sugar being consumed in 4 meals are in the contrary different than that of the previous 2 nutrients. The highest consumption of added sugar happens in snacks, with 42%. Dinner comes as the second, with 23%. Lunch and breakfast take up the third and fourth proportion with 19% and 16% each. Sample 3. The pie chart reflect the average percentages in standard meals of 3 types of nutrients, all of which might be poisoning for us if eaten too much. Overall, the most part of all 3 categories of nutrients is used when taking dinner, while the least we receive when having a breakfast. When having a dinner we receive 43% of sodium and 37% of saturated fat, which is all takes the biggest part in our chart. While discussing added sugar for dinner have an amount of 23%, which is just a half of our sodium receiving. However, for lunch we also have a big amount of sodium and saturated fat, which is 29% and 26%. While we have less sugar, it counts for 19%. Eating snacks we receive just 14% of sodium and 21% of saturated fat, which is not a lot. But speaking about sugar, we have as much as 42%. Breakfast at the same time has the worst parentage of all nutrients we receive. They are all maybe the same. It is 16% to both sugar and saturated fat, and just 14% for sodium. 185. Sample 4. The given pie charts illustrate the proportion of sodium, saturated fat and added sugar used in breakfast, dinner, lunch, and snacks in the USA. All of that nutrients may be harmful if eaten too much. Overall, the rate of sodium and saturated fat are the highest for dinner, while sodium for snacks and breakfast is the lowest proportion at all. In addition, added sugar is the highest percentage for snacks. It is clear that sodium and saturated fat are added in dinner by 43% and 37% relatively, which are the highest percentage at all. Meanwhile, all of 3 nutrients eaten in breakfast are quite low, around 14 to 16%. In snacks, added sugar accounts for 42%, which is more than saturated fat 2 times, 21%, and sodium 3 times, 14%. Besides, sodium, saturated fat and added sugar in lunch are from 19% to 19%. Sample 5, Band 8. The 3 pie charts reveal the average percentages of sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar in the staple diet consumed in the USA. Interestingly, all these nutrients can wreak havoc on an individual's health if consumed beyond a prescribed limit. On closer inspection, the data suggests that breakfast contains the lowest proportion of all three nutrients, whereas lunch and dinner have a higher concentration of sodium and saturated fat. Snacks, as expected, has more of added sugar than any other meal. Firstly, sodium constitutes 43% of dinner and decreases to 29% for lunch. Breakfast and snacks share the same amount of this nutrient, 14% each. Secondly, saturated fat makes up 37% of supper and 26% of the midday meal, and this is closely followed by snacks or treats, which contribute 21% of it. Surprisingly, breakfast is packed with merely 16% of fat. Finally, sugar has the highest concentration in light meals, at a staggering 42%. The evening meal adds another 23%, followed by lunch and breakfast at 19% and 16%, respectively. Vocabulary reveal: make known to others staple diet, a food that is eaten routinely. Wreak havoc, to cause damage. Prescribed limit, allowed/suggested limit. Data suggests, given information point to nutrients, a substance that provides nourishment essential for the maintenance of life and for growth. Concentration, the relative amount of a particular substance contained within a solution or mixture. Supper, an evening meal; dinner, midday meal; lunch, the afternoon meal. Light meals; snacks, staggering, shockingly high, deeply shocking, astonishing. Evening meal, dinner. Sample answer 6. The charts in the figure above show the different amounts of nutrients consumed during a typical day, which consist of a person having 3 meals: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The 3 nutrients listed are sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar in the diet. It is to be noted that these nutrients, if consumed excessively, can lead to myriad problems such as hypertension, diabetes, and several other cardiovascular diseases. It is evident from the chart above that the majority of the sodium consumed comes from dinner, while breakfast and snacks contain an equal amount of sodium consumed daily. The meal taken during the lunch hour contains approximately 29% of the daily sodium intake of an average person. Likewise, the biggest source of saturated fat is dinner, which accounts for 37.0% of the total daily fat intake. The second and third source of fat consumption is lunch and snacks, accounting for 26.0 and 21%, respectively. It appears that breakfast contains the least amount of fat consumed during the day. The final chart shows the sources of added sugar on an average day, and not surprisingly, snacks are the biggest source of sugar, accounting for roughly 42% of persons' daily intake. The second largest source of sugar is dinner, followed by lunch and breakfast. Breakfast contributes the least amount of sugar to a person's daily intake. Model paragraph, 3 pie charts, labeled sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar, show the percentage of that nutrient consumed in each of 4 meals in a typical day. This data is from the average American diet, which consists of 4 meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and in-between meal snacks. Overall, while the majority of sodium and saturated fats are consumed in the dinner meal, added sugars are mostly eaten in snack wrong form. In addition, breakfast is by far the healthiest meal of during the day. The average percentages of sodium and saturated fats consumption in the dinner meal are the highest, 43% and 37% respectively. Both are that is followed by those of lunch, with 29% for sodium and 26% for saturated fat. However, there is just 23% of added sugar consumed through eating at dinner and nearly 1/5 at through eating lunch. In terms of breakfast, contains more or less around 15% of those nutrients is eaten during it. Regarding snacks, its average percentage for added sugar constitutes up to 42%, while those for sodium and saturated fat are barely 14% and 21% accordingly.